The Henderson family stepped out of their gleaming black SUV with the kind of exaggerated flair that drew attention. Mr. Henderson, a stocky man in his late 50s with a booming voice and an overinflated sense of importance, clutched his designer sunglasses like a trophy. Beside him, Mrs. Henderson adjusted her wide-brimmed hat, her manicured fingers twitching as if in anticipation of finding flaws. Their 2 teenage children, Ashley and Brandon, rolled their eyes at the tropical scenery, already bored despite the breathtaking luxury surrounding them. Paradise Cove Resort was a slice of heaven. Pristine beaches stretched endlessly, palm trees swayed lazily in the breeze, and the entrance alone, adorned with cascading fountains, spoke of unparalleled opulence. The Hendersons weren't impressed. "This better be as exclusive as the brochure claimed," Mrs. Henderson sniffed, her heels clicking sharply on the marble floor. They didn't notice Jasmine right away. Wearing the understated uniform of a resort maid, she blended in seamlessly with the staff. Her eyes sparkled with amusement as she observed the family's arrival, but her smile was carefully neutral. Jasmine had mastered the art of staying unnoticed, which, in this particular instance, was entirely intentional. Today, she wasn't Jasmine, the sharp-witted owner of Paradise Cove Resort. Today, she was simply the help. As the family approached the check-in desk, their loud complaints began. Mr. Henderson barked about the air conditioning in the SUV being too cold. Ashley grumbled that there was no red carpet. Brandon, a perpetually bored 16-year-old, muttered something about how even private jets aren't this basic. "Excuse me, you," Mrs. Henderson said, snapping her fingers at Jasmine, who had been quietly observing from a corner. Jasmine turned slowly, her professional smile in place. "Yes, ma'am? Take our bags," Mrs. Henderson commanded, gesturing at the mountain of designer luggage being unloaded from the SUV. "And be careful. That one's Louis Vuitton, and it's worth more than your monthly paycheck." Jasmine tilted her head slightly, her smile unwavering. "Of course, ma'am. I'll handle it with care." She hefted one of the suitcases, noting it was unnecessarily heavy. Probably packed with things they didn't need but wanted to flaunt. As she turned to leave, Brandon whispered loudly, "She's probably never even heard of Louis Vuitton." The family chuckled, the sound grating and smug. Jasmine kept her composure, but her mind was already working. She had met plenty of guests like the Hendersons over the years, entitled, dismissive, and completely oblivious to the realities of life beyond their privilege. But she never let it get to her. Not anymore. At the check-in desk, the family continued their barrage of demands. Mr. Henderson wanted the finest suite with an ocean view. Mrs. Henderson demanded a full itinerary of exclusive activities, emphasizing the word as if the thought of mingling with regular guests was beneath her. Ashley asked if the resort had Wi-Fi fast enough for live streaming, while Brandon wanted to know if the golf carts had custom rims. The receptionist, a young man named Carlos, handled their complaints with practiced patience. Jasmine observed from the background, noting how Carlos's knuckles whitened slightly when Mrs. Henderson corrected his pronunciation of her name. "It's Henderson," she drawled. "Not Hendricks. Is that so difficult?" Jasmine made a mental note. Carlos was one of her best employees, dedicated, kind, and professional. He didn't deserve their condescension. Few people did. As she continued to carry their luggage, Jasmine caught snippets of their conversation. "This place better be worth it," Mr. Henderson grumbled. "We could have gone to Maui again, but no, you insisted on this boutique place." Mrs. Henderson waved him off. "Maui's too crowded with tourists. This is supposed to be exclusive. If they don't meet my standards, they'll hear about it on every travel review site." Jasmine raised an eyebrow but kept walking. She had deliberately kept Paradise Cove under the radar, relying on word of mouth from loyal guests who appreciated its unique charm. Most of them were respectful, recognizing the value of the experience she had crafted. The Hendersons, however, were clearly not part of her usual clientele. At the suites, Jasmine placed their luggage with precision, despite their dismissive attitudes. "Don't scuff the floor," Mrs. Henderson snapped as Jasmine set down the last suitcase. Jasmine straightened, her smile never faltering. Of course, ma'am. Enjoy your stay. As she exited, she overheard Ashley complain about the decor. It's like they tried too hard to be fancy. It's giving cheap. Jasmine bit back a laugh. If only they knew the effort and thought that went into every detail of the resort, from the custom furniture made by local artisans to the eco-friendly materials used in construction. Once out of earshot, Jasmine allowed herself a small, knowing smile. The Hendersons didn't realize it yet, but they had just entered a game they were woefully unprepared for. The Hendersons were only beginning to scratch the surface of the chaos they had unknowingly stepped into. Jasmine, still dressed in the maid's uniform, had already made her way down to the staff room, where she exchanged knowing glances with her team. They were all in on the plan, but they didn't know just how far Jasmine was willing to push things. First things first, it was time to give them what they thought they wanted: luxury, exclusivity, and a sense of power. They would get all that, but not in the way they expected. Jasmine smiled to herself as she picked up the phone and called the spa. Yes, let's schedule them for the VIP treatment. Mud therapy, she said with a grin that could only be described as mischievous. The receptionist hesitated. Ma'am, are you sure? I'm absolutely sure. They'll love it. She hung up and then sent a message to the activity coordinator. It was time to plan something truly unforgettable. Jasmine had no intention of giving the Hendersons the vacation they expected. Instead, she would show them the hilarious consequences of their pretension. By the time the Hendersons made their way to the spa, they had already started to grumble about the temperature of the air conditioning in the suite. They complained about the towels being too soft, the pillows not firm enough, and of course, the Wi-Fi not being fast enough to support their daughter's constant streaming. Their complaints were endless, each one more absurd than the last. Good afternoon, Mr. and Mrs. Henderson. Jasmine greeted them as they walked through the spa's entrance. She made sure to smile warmly, her tone polite yet just on the edge of condescension. Finally, someone who knows how to treat us properly, Mrs. Henderson said, flipping her hair as she took a seat. I expect only the best today. Are we going to be pampered like royalty? Jasmine smiled again. Of course. Your mud bath awaits. Mrs. Henderson wrinkled her nose. Mud bath? I didn't sign up for that. I specifically asked for the most exclusive treatment. Jasmine, unfazed, gestured to the attendant who led them to the mud treatment area. The Hendersons were far from impressed, though Jasmine knew that once they were submerged in the thick, dark clay, they would change their tune. The Hendersons reluctantly settled into the baths. Jasmine stood by, making sure everything went according to plan. As the mud began to settle on their skin, Mr. Henderson let out a dramatic groan. This is not what I signed up for. I demand a refund. Jasmine held her ground. I'm sorry, sir. This is the most exclusive treatment we offer. It's a rare, locally sourced mud known for its healing properties. Mrs. Henderson looked horrified. Do I look like someone who needs healing? She snapped, her voice tight with frustration. Jasmine simply nodded, keeping her tone neutral. It's very rejuvenating, ma'am. The Hendersons were growing more irate by the minute, their discomfort palpable as the mud began to dry and tighten. This is ridiculous, Mr. Henderson muttered. I could have been in the best 5-star resort in the world, but no, I'm here in this mud pit. Jasmine bit back a laugh. She couldn't wait for the next part of the plan to unfold. The entire spa was rigged with hidden cameras, all set to capture every second of their increasingly bizarre experience. Meanwhile, across the resort, the other staff members were getting ready for their next move. They had noticed how much the Hendersons had been complaining about the service, and they were more than happy to play along with Jasmine's scheme. The afternoon unfolded with even more absurdities. Jasmine arranged for the Hendersons to attend a so-called VIP dinner, which turned out to be a local talent show for children. The Hendersons were unamused, especially when they were seated at a table that faced the stage, where kids were enthusiastically singing and dancing. Oh, this is just perfect, Mr. Henderson grumbled as a little girl in a bright pink tutu twirled in front of him. We paid for an exclusive experience, and we're stuck here watching children perform? Jasmine, pretending to be nothing more than an innocent bystander, walked by and gave him a sympathetic smile. It's part of our resort's community outreach program, sir. It's about giving back to the local youth. Well, I don't give a damn about the local youth, Mrs. Henderson snapped. Where's the real entertainment? Jasmine's response was quick and smooth. The real entertainment is about experiencing something different, ma'am. Isn't that the point of vacation? She knew their discomfort was only growing, but Jasmine wasn't about to let up. The next step would push them further. She'd already arranged for the next night's entertainment, a karaoke contest. But it wasn't going to be any ordinary karaoke night. Jasmine had a few surprises in store. By the time the karaoke event rolled around, the Hendersons were already in a state of semi-dread. They had spent the entire day complaining about one thing or another, and their frustration had reached a boiling point. But Jasmine wasn't worried. Her plan was working perfectly. As they walked into the event space, they were greeted by Jasmine herself, who welcomed them warmly. I'm so glad you could join us for tonight's entertainment, she said. I'm sure you'll have a great time. Oh, I'm sure we will, Mrs. Henderson muttered, eyeing the stage warily. Just as long as it's not something ridiculous. Jasmine smiled. Don't worry. It's a fun, casual event. We're all here to enjoy ourselves. The night began, and the guests, mostly regular vacationers, started to get up and sing, laughing and having fun. But Jasmine had something special in mind for the Hendersons. It was time to expose them for who they really were. As the night wore on, Mrs. Henderson was invited to join the stage for her turn at karaoke. Come on, Mrs. Henderson, the spotlight's waiting for you, Jasmine called from the side, her voice full of cheer. Mrs. Henderson hesitated, but the crowd encouraged her. When she finally got up to the microphone, she let out a loud, off-key rendition of I Will Survive. The crowd snickered, and even Mr. Henderson looked uncomfortable. But Jasmine wasn't finished. As Mrs. Henderson belted out another horrific note, Jasmine pulled the microphone away, dropping it dramatically to the floor. The entire room went silent for a split second before breaking into laughter. The Hendersons were now fully aware they had been set up, but it was too late. They had become the laughingstock of the entire resort, and Jasmine's plan had worked perfectly. The Hendersons were not prepared for what came next. The crowd's laughter still echoed in the karaoke room, and the tension between the Hendersons and the other guests grew palpable. Mrs. Henderson's face was flushed with embarrassment, while Mr. Henderson's mouth twisted in a mix of anger and humiliation. But Jasmine, still wearing her maid's uniform, stood at the back of the room, trying to suppress her grin. As the laughter died down, the Hendersons, clearly rattled, tried to regain some semblance of composure. Mr. Henderson cleared his throat, standing up straighter as if attempting to command the room's attention. This is highly inappropriate, he muttered, his voice louder than it needed to be. We came here for a relaxing, high-class experience, not to be made fools of by a bunch of lowlives. Jasmine didn't flinch. She calmly walked over to him, her smile still in place, and replied, Sir, I'm truly sorry if your experience hasn't met your expectations. But here at Paradise Cove, we believe in letting our guests truly experience the local culture. It's not about luxury, it's about authenticity. Her words landed with the precision of a well-aimed dart, and the other guests, who had been quietly watching the spectacle unfold, nodded in agreement. Jasmine could see the change in their expressions. They were no longer quietly judging the Hendersons but were beginning to show some support for the way she was handling the situation. Mr. Henderson's face reddened further, but instead of lashing out, he took a deep breath. I think we've had enough of this. We'll be checking out tomorrow. I demand a full refund for the humiliation we've endured. Jasmine's gaze remained steady, unwavering. I completely understand, sir. I'll arrange for your checkout, but I must remind you that the services provided were exactly as described in the brochure. She paused, letting her words sink in. And the entertainment tonight was entirely voluntary. He scowled but didn't respond. Instead, he stormed off to the side, muttering under his breath. Jasmine turned her attention to the remaining guests. With one simple gesture, she signaled for the next part of her plan to begin. Meanwhile, the Hendersons began retreating to their suite, clearly rattled by the unexpected turn of events. The pride they had carried into the resort was now crumbling, and the mockery they'd been subjected to had left a bitter taste in their mouths. But Jasmine had no sympathy. She knew they would never understand the lessons they were supposed to take away from this experience. As the Hendersons reached their suite, they began to complain loudly about everything from the decor to the food, which had arrived earlier that evening. "This place is a joke," Mrs. Henderson said, slamming her purse onto the table. "How can they treat us like this? We're paying good money for this nonsense." But there was no one around to hear them. Jasmine had anticipated this moment, so she made sure that her staff, was prepared. A team of cleaners was dispatched to their suite under the guise of a routine maintenance check, and they began their work immediately. They weren't there to clean, they were there to push the boundaries of the Hendersons' tolerance for discomfort. The cleaners, part of Jasmine's loyal team, were well trained in the art of subtle sabotage. They rearranged the furniture just slightly, moved personal items to different spots, and even replaced the expensive toiletries with cheap alternatives. The Hendersons, still too proud to ask for help, would have no choice but to notice the small changes that had been made to their suite. Back at the karaoke night, the mood was shifting. The guests who had witnessed the Hendersons' downfall were slowly warming to the idea that maybe, just maybe, the resort wasn't about the money, it was about something deeper. Jasmine had made her point, and it was landing more effectively than she had anticipated. Jasmine smiled to herself as she passed by the other guests, her team having already set up the next event, a local artisan market that would be held on the beach the following morning. This wasn't just about making the Hendersons look foolish, it was about showcasing what the resort was truly about: authenticity, culture, and community. Jasmine's plan had evolved over the years from a simple business strategy to a passion for promoting inclusivity, diversity, and a more enriching type of luxury. She was about to give the Hendersons an experience they would never forget. The next morning arrived, and the Hendersons, still seething with anger over the previous night, stepped onto the beach to find themselves face to face with the stark contrast to what they had been expecting. Instead of the exclusive, pristine event they had been anticipating, there was a bustling market of local artisans, selling handmade jewelry, clothing, and crafts. The air was filled with the smells of traditional street food, and the sounds of live music echoed from one end of the beach to the other. Jasmine was waiting for them. Dressed in a chic, casual outfit, one that effortlessly blended with the local culture, she approached the Hendersons with a warm smile. "Good morning, Mr. and Mrs. Henderson," she greeted them cheerfully. "I hope you're ready to immerse yourselves in the local culture. Today, we're celebrating the artisans of this region." Mrs. Henderson's face twisted in disbelief. "This is what we get? This is the so-called exclusive experience you promised?" Jasmine stood her ground, her voice calm but assertive. "I'm afraid this is the experience we offer, ma'am. It's about learning, connecting, and supporting the local community. Not everything here revolves around money or status." The Hendersons were furious, but the crowd that had gathered for the market was watching, curious to see how they would react. Jasmine knew this was a moment of reckoning. She knew that in this space, their entitled attitudes would be exposed for everyone to see. Jasmine had long been an advocate for change, for creating spaces that were inclusive and diverse. She believed in transformation, not just for herself but for everyone around her. The Hendersons, whether they realized it or not, were about to witness the impact of that transformation. She didn't say another word but simply turned and walked towards the market, where the other guests were already mingling with the artisans. The Hendersons, after a long silence, had no choice but to follow. They were stuck in the very environment they had tried to mock, and Jasmine was going to make sure they understood the value of the experience, even if it took everything she had. As the Hendersons hesitantly walked through the market, the contrast between their discomfort and the vibrant energy around them was unmistakable. The colorful stalls, bursting with locally crafted goods and the sounds of live music, seemed like a direct challenge to their expectations. Jasmine, now walking ahead with purpose, was fully aware that this moment was crucial. It wasn't just about making them uncomfortable anymore. It was about changing their worldview, teaching them a lesson they would never forget. The Hendersons tried to maintain their aloof demeanor, but it was impossible to ignore the warm smiles and the enthusiasm of the local vendors. They were genuinely proud of their work, and it showed. Mrs. Henderson sneered as she walked past a stall where a woman was hand-weaving baskets. "This is what you call luxury," she muttered under her breath. "I thought we were here for some real pampering, not this." Jasmine turned slightly, catching the words but not reacting immediately. She had already predicted the Hendersons' dismissal of everything around them. What they failed to understand was that luxury didn't always come in the form of designer brands or private beaches. Sometimes, it was about authentic experiences, cultural exchange, and genuine human connection. At a stall featuring hand-painted pottery, Mr. Henderson picked up a small dish with disdain. "What is this? What am I supposed to do with this? This isn't even a real collectible," he scoffed. Jasmine stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "That dish isn't meant to be a collectible. It's a representation of the local culture, created by someone who takes pride in their work. It's something more meaningful than just an object to flaunt." The Hendersons exchanged incredulous glances. "Meaningful?" Mrs. Henderson echoed, still struggling to grasp the concept. "How is this meaningful? We're supposed to be on vacation, not shopping for trinkets." Jasmine smiled slightly. "Sometimes the trinkets are more valuable than the flashy things we collect. It's about finding meaning in the small, authentic experiences." Mr. Henderson scoffed, clearly irritated by the encounter. "We don't need any of this. Just give us what we paid for." Jasmine gave a soft chuckle, not a mocking one but one laced with genuine understanding. "What you paid for, Mr. Henderson, is an experience. And part of that experience is learning, even when it's uncomfortable." She turned away, signaling the staff to move forward with their plan. Jasmine wasn't going to let this moment slip away. The Hendersons needed to understand that what they were experiencing wasn't just about a vacation, it was about perspective. As they wandered deeper into the market, Jasmine led them to a stage where a group of local children were performing traditional dances. The audience, composed mainly of other resort guests, was captivated by the rhythm and energy of the dancers. The Hendersons, however, seemed more preoccupied with their own dissatisfaction. "Is this some kind of joke?" Mrs. Henderson asked loudly, drawing the attention of nearby guests. "We didn't come here for this." Before Jasmine could respond, a voice from the crowd chimed in. "Actually, this is one of the best parts of the resort experience. The kids here are incredibly talented. It's something you won't get anywhere else." Jasmine smiled inwardly as the guest continued. "We're here to support them. It's amazing to see how these children's talents are nurtured." The Hendersons didn't know how to respond. Their usual tactics, bragging, asserting dominance, weren't working here. They were out of their element. Jasmine knew this was the tipping point. They could either keep resisting, or they could embrace what was in front of them. Mr. Henderson, frustrated, muttered something about contacting the resort's management. But Jasmine was already steps ahead. "You're free to voice your concerns, sir. But the point of this market and the performances is to showcase what makes this place unique. It's not for everyone, but it's what we offer." She turned to face the stage, where the children were now performing an elaborate dance routine. The crowd was clapping along, caught up in the joy of the moment. Mrs. Henderson, unable to ignore the energy of the performance, crossed her arms but stopped complaining. The shift in their behavior was subtle, but it was there. Jasmine had planted the seed. Now, all she had to do was water it. Later that afternoon, Jasmine arranged for the Hendersons to attend a private dinner with a local chef. The meal was meant to showcase the best of the island's cuisine, a true reflection of the community and its heritage. But when the chef brought out the first dish, something as simple as fresh coconut ceviche, Mrs. Henderson immediately wrinkled her nose. "What is this? This looks like something you'd eat off the side of the road." Jasmine, playing the role of the accommodating maid, smiled brightly. I assure you, ma'am, this is a delicacy. The ingredients are freshly harvested from the local farms. It's not about how it looks, but about how it tastes. The chef, standing nearby, nodded enthusiastically. The ceviche is prepared using only the finest, organic coconuts picked this morning. But Mrs. Henderson wasn't having it. She pushed the dish aside with an exaggerated motion. I'll have the lobster, please. And make sure it's cooked properly. Jasmine's patience was wearing thin, but she maintained her composed exterior. She was determined to show the Hendersons just how ridiculous their attitudes had become. The next course was a savory seafood stew, made with freshly caught fish. Mr. Henderson looked at it suspiciously. What is this? It's not even properly seasoned. He barely took a bite before pushing the bowl away. Jasmine raised an eyebrow. It's traditional island cuisine, sir. The flavors are subtle, and the spices come from local herbs. He scoffed again. I've eaten at 5-star restaurants all over the world. This is nothing like what I'm used to. Jasmine knew he wouldn't change overnight, but she was relentless. You're right, sir. It's nothing like what you're used to. But that's the point. Sometimes, trying something new can be uncomfortable at first, but it opens doors to new experiences. Mrs. Henderson stared at her husband, clearly irritated. I don't think I can take much more of this. Jasmine looked at her with a knowing smile. You're more than welcome to leave, ma'am. But I'd encourage you to stay just a bit longer. There's still so much to experience. The table fell silent, and for a moment, the Hendersons seemed lost in thought. Jasmine didn't let up. She continued with the meal, offering gentle suggestions and making sure the conversation always turned toward understanding the island's culture and the deeper meanings behind the food they were rejecting. By the end of the meal, their attitude had softened just slightly. They weren't completely converted, but they were beginning to realize that their usual demands weren't going to get them what they wanted here. Jasmine had planted another seed. She knew that this wasn't just about getting them to like the food or the music. It was about changing their perception of what luxury meant. And slowly, over time, the Hendersons would come to understand that the resort wasn't just a place for the rich to flaunt their wealth. It was a space for everyone to grow, to learn, and to experience life in a way they had never considered. The atmosphere in the resort had become charged with a strange energy as the Hendersons continued their stay. The sense of discomfort that had been palpable when they first arrived had evolved into something more subtle, a quiet resistance mixed with reluctant curiosity. Jasmine could see it in their eyes. They were still pretending to hold on to their previous attitudes, but she knew that beneath the surface, the shift had begun. As the week progressed, Jasmine orchestrated moments of exposure with expert precision, always keeping her distance, making sure the Hendersons remained unaware of her true identity. The resort staff, who had come to admire her for her grace and leadership, followed her instructions with precision. They set up activities designed to gently push the Hendersons out of their comfort zones, forcing them to confront the world they had long dismissed. It started with a cooking class. Jasmine had arranged for a renowned local chef to teach a group of guests how to prepare a traditional island dish. It wasn't about the food itself, it was about the experience, the camaraderie that came with it. But the Hendersons, as expected, were less than thrilled. They found every excuse to act as though they were above such an activity. Mr. Henderson complained about the heat of the outdoor kitchen, about the lack of air conditioning. Mrs. Henderson kept glancing at her watch, as though the time she spent here was somehow being wasted. But Jasmine didn't give them an inch. She smiled politely, encouraging them to participate and learn. She wasn't going to let them skip out on this moment. The cooking class, despite their reluctance, forced the Hendersons to interact with the locals in a way they never would have chosen. They had to get their hands dirty, chopping vegetables and stirring pots. There was no way around it. Their previous arrogance melted away as they found themselves laughing, talking to the locals, and even sharing a few jokes. By the time the meal was ready to serve, there was a sense of accomplishment that they couldn't ignore. The food tasted better than they had expected, and for a brief moment, they shared a feeling of connection with the people around them, something they had never experienced in their privileged world. Jasmine watched from the corner of the room, a small smile tugging at her lips. But it wasn't just about the cooking class. Jasmine had planned a series of smaller, more personal moments that would challenge their ingrained prejudices. The next was a traditional storytelling evening, where the locals gathered around a bonfire to share their myths and legends. The Hendersons were initially dismissive, but Jasmine insisted. She encouraged them to sit down, to listen, to understand the rich cultural tapestry that had been woven over centuries. The stories, told by an elder from the village, spoke of resilience, love, and the cycles of nature. Jasmine subtly steered the conversation toward themes of overcoming adversity, highlighting the strength and wisdom that had been passed down through generations. The Hendersons, despite themselves, were entranced. The elder spoke of how the community had thrived by working together, how they had embraced diversity and inclusion even when faced with challenges. Jasmine made sure to emphasize that these lessons weren't just for the locals, they were for everyone, no matter their background. As the evening came to a close, the Hendersons found themselves sitting in silence, staring into the embers of the fire. It was clear that something had shifted within them, though either of them would admit it aloud. Jasmine knew, however, that the seeds had been planted. She had given them a glimpse of a world they had been too closed off to see. The following day, Jasmine arranged for the Hendersons to join a community volunteer program, where guests could help with local conservation efforts. She could tell from their initial reluctance that they were once again determined to resist, but she wasn't about to let them off the hook. The volunteer work was simple, planting trees, cleaning up the beach, but it was physical, it was real, and it required them to get out of their comfort zones. Mrs. Henderson, in particular, balked at the idea of getting her hands dirty. But Jasmine, ever the subtle instigator, reminded her that the true luxury of a vacation wasn't just about relaxation, it was about making a positive impact. As they worked together under the scorching sun, Jasmine watched the transformation unfold. The Hendersons, initially stiff and unwilling, began to loosen up. The local children who had come to help playfully challenged Mr. Henderson to see who could plant the most trees. And to everyone's surprise, he took the challenge seriously. By the time the day came to a close, there was a sense of accomplishment in the air, something the Hendersons hadn't expected. They had been so caught up in their own world that they had forgotten what it was like to contribute, to make a difference in the lives of others. It wasn't just about the work, they had found a connection to the community, something they had never considered before. That evening, the resort hosted a special dinner to celebrate the completion of the conservation project. Jasmine, standing off to the side, observed the Hendersons as they sat at the table. They were quieter now, more reflective. Mrs. Henderson, who had once scoffed at the idea of volunteering, was actually chatting with some of the local workers. Mr. Henderson was discussing the project with one of the community leaders, asking questions he would have never considered before. Jasmine could sense the change in them, a subtle shift in their worldview. They were no longer the same privileged tourists who had arrived at the resort, expecting to be catered to without question. They had been humbled, and though they would never admit it, they were beginning to see the world through a different lens. Jasmine knew her work wasn't done. There were still lessons to be learned, still growth to be had. But she was content. The Hendersons, once so dismissive, had begun to embrace the lessons of inclusion, empathy, and personal growth. It wasn't just about their behavior, it was about their hearts, their understanding of the world and the people around them. As the night wore on, Jasmine made her way to the back of the resort, where she took a moment to reflect on her journey. The resort wasn't just a business for her, it was a space where she could foster change, where she could help people confront their biases and grow beyond them. Her work was far from over, but as she looked out over the peaceful landscape, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The Hendersons might have come to the resort expecting a luxury vacation, but they were leaving with something far more valuable, an understanding of the true meaning of wealth. It wasn't about money, status, or material possessions. It was about connection, respect, and the legacy they would leave behind. And for Jasmine, that was the ultimate victory. By now, the Hendersons had transformed. They were no longer the same entitled, self-absorbed couple who had arrived at the resort. Each interaction, each task they undertook, had chipped away at their previous assumptions. Jasmine had witnessed their discomfort, their resistance, and ultimately, their quiet understanding as the days passed. But she knew that the final test, the moment that would truly cement their change, was fast approaching. It wasn't enough that they had participated in the activities. It wasn't even enough that they had learned to appreciate the value of hard work and community. To Jasmine, real change meant they needed to understand the weight of accountability, the idea that true privilege comes with a responsibility to others, and that the world doesn't revolve around them. Jasmine decided to give them a challenge that would force them to confront this responsibility head-on. The resort was preparing for its annual charity event, a gala aimed at raising funds for local education and health initiatives. The Hendersons had been invited to the event, of course, but it was Jasmine's plan to have them contribute in a way they never would have expected. She arranged for them to be part of the charity auction, not as buyers or guests, but as the featured contributors. The idea was simple: the Hendersons would donate their time to a special local project, and the guests at the event would bid on the chance to join them. But there was a catch. Jasmine had arranged for a few local families to attend the event, and she made sure the Hendersons would interact with them in a more personal way. At first, the Hendersons were confused. They had expected the event to be an opportunity for them to rub elbows with the rich and famous, to flaunt their status. Instead, they found themselves talking to a group of hardworking local families who had come to share their stories. One mother spoke of raising 3 children on her own while working 2 jobs. Another man shared how he had worked to build a small business that helped support his community. The Hendersons, for the first time, were face to face with the people they had long ignored, and they didn't know how to react. Jasmine had done this deliberately. She knew that the Hendersons needed to see the world from the perspective of the people they had once dismissed. The charity event wasn't about the glitz and glamour of the social scene. It was about real people, real struggles, and real change. Jasmine watched from the sidelines, her heart swelling with pride as the Hendersons began to ask questions, to listen, and to understand. As the auction progressed, the Hendersons' initial awkwardness faded, replaced by a genuine curiosity. They had begun to realize that the wealth they had taken for granted wasn't the only measure of success. The true value in life, they were beginning to see, was in the connections they made and the impact they had on others. They no longer saw the event as a spectacle to be enjoyed, they saw it as a chance to give back. At the end of the evening, the auction raised more money than anyone had anticipated. The Hendersons had contributed far more than just a donation. They had offered their time, their presence, and their support to the cause. It was a moment of reckoning, a moment of redemption. Jasmine's strategy had worked. The Hendersons had faced the uncomfortable reality of their privilege and come out the other side with a renewed sense of purpose. But Jasmine wasn't finished yet. The real test would come the following day when she organized a final, unexpected twist. She invited the Hendersons to join her on a community-building excursion. This time, however, it wasn't about giving back or making donations. It was about stepping into the shoes of those who had taught them so much over the past week, living a day in the life of a local worker. The idea was simple. Jasmine would take them on a tour of a nearby farm, where they would spend the day working side by side with the farmers. They would help plant crops, feed animals, and learn the intricacies of life on the island from the people who had lived and worked there for generations. When Jasmine presented the idea, the Hendersons were shocked. It was one thing to participate in a community event. It was another to get their hands dirty in the actual work. But Jasmine was insistent. This, she told them, is where the real value lies. Not in the luxuries of the resort, but in the labor that makes everything possible. They reluctantly agreed, and the following morning, they found themselves out in the fields under the blazing sun, digging, planting, and sweating alongside the farmers. It was hard work. The kind of work they had never considered before. The labor was backbreaking, and the heat was oppressive. But as the day wore on, something remarkable began to happen. The Hendersons began to see the world through new eyes. They watched as the local farmers worked with an ease and grace they had never imagined. They saw the deep connection the workers had to the land, to the crops they tended, and to the community they supported. The Hendersons, who had spent their lives in cushioned boardrooms and luxury resorts, had never experienced anything like this before. By the end of the day, they were exhausted, covered in dirt, and sore in places they didn't even know they had muscles. But there was a sense of pride in their eyes, a recognition of just how much work went into making the world around them function. They had gained a new appreciation for the people who had supported their lifestyle without even realizing it. As they sat down to a simple meal with the farmers that evening, Jasmine watched as the Hendersons interacted with the workers in a way they never had before. They were no longer looking down on them, no longer seeing them as beneath them. They were speaking as equals, sharing stories, laughing, and learning from one another. Jasmine felt a surge of pride. This was the transformation she had hoped for. As the sun set, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink, Jasmine knew the Hendersons had come full circle. They had started as ignorant, privileged outsiders, but now they were leaving as more enlightened, humble people. They had faced their biases, their discomfort, and their privilege, and they had come out the other side stronger, more compassionate, and more aware of the world around them. Jasmine, too, had grown. She had seen firsthand the power of empathy, the importance of mentorship, and the profound impact that understanding and growth could have on people. Her resort had not just been a place for relaxation, it had been a space for transformation. As the Hendersons left the island, Jasmine watched them go with a sense of fulfillment. She had given them more than just a luxury vacation. She had given them a new perspective, one that would shape their future actions and interactions. They would never forget the lessons they had learned, the people they had met, and the transformation they had undergone. Jasmine's mission had been a success, but more importantly, she had sparked a change in the Hendersons that would ripple out into the world beyond the resort. It was a small victory, but it was one that mattered. And Jasmine knew that, in the end, that was all that really counted. By now, the change in the Hendersons had become undeniable. The previous days of awkwardness and resistance had given way to something far more meaningful: self-awareness, genuine curiosity, and most importantly, a willingness to challenge their own assumptions. The activities Jasmine had organized were no longer just tasks or lessons, they had become transformative experiences. Yet, as the week drew to a close, Jasmine knew that there was one final hurdle to overcome. She had noticed something subtle, a lingering sense of discomfort. Though the Hendersons had embraced their new perspectives, there was still a gap between them and the locals. They had engaged with the workers, participated in the community events, and even learned to appreciate the value of hard labor. But there was something else they hadn't yet fully grasped: the concept of vulnerability. It was one thing to change your behavior in response to new knowledge. It was another to open yourself up completely and acknowledge the impact of your actions, not just in terms of what you've learned, but in how it affects others. The idea of vulnerability wasn't easy for the Hendersons. They had spent years cultivating an image of success, control, and superiority. To expose their flaws, to show their weaknesses, felt like a step backward. But Jasmine knew that this was the key to their true growth. They had learned how to take responsibility for their privilege, but now they needed to take responsibility for their impact, both on the resort and on the people who worked there. Jasmine had been planning the final event of the week for some time. It wasn't going to be like the other events. They weren't going to be on display, showing off their newfound humility for the world to see. Instead, it would be a private conversation. A moment of raw honesty, where the Hendersons would have to reflect not just on what they had learned, but on the ways they had previously perpetuated harm without even realizing it. The evening was set. Jasmine invited the Hendersons to a quiet dinner on the beach, surrounded by the workers and their families. There would be no speeches, no performances, just a simple gathering of people who had learned from one another. The intention was to create a space where everyone could reflect on the week, share their thoughts, and most importantly, listen. As the night unfolded, Jasmine watched the Hendersons closely. They had come a long way from the arrogant, disconnected couple who had first arrived. They were no longer trying to dominate the conversation or steer it back to their own experiences. They were listening. They were hearing the stories of the workers, the struggles, the resilience, and the victories, and they were taking it all in. Jasmine watched as the Hendersons began to realize the depth of their privilege, not just in terms of wealth, but in the opportunities they had been given, the doors that had opened for them that had been closed for others. There was a rawness to the moment, a deep honesty that was both uncomfortable and liberating. The Hendersons started to speak, but their words were different now. They weren't making excuses or trying to explain away their actions. They were acknowledging the pain their behavior had caused and expressing genuine regret. It was a humbling experience, one that required vulnerability in a way the Hendersons had never experienced before. And yet, as they shared their reflections, Jasmine felt a sense of relief. This was what the Hendersons needed to truly understand: the power of accountability. Not just to recognize their mistakes, but to confront them head-on, without fear of judgment. The evening was filled with conversations that spanned beyond small talk. It was an exchange of stories, struggles, and hopes. The Hendersons weren't just learning from the workers anymore. They were building connections, forming friendships, and developing a deeper understanding of what it meant to be part of a community. But Jasmine knew that this moment wasn't just about the Hendersons. It was also about the workers. For so long, they had been undervalued, overlooked, and silenced. This was their moment, too, to stand in their truth, to be heard, and to feel respected. Jasmine had orchestrated this gathering not just for the Hendersons, but for the workers who had carried the resort on their shoulders. It was their opportunity to reclaim their dignity and be seen for the strength they possessed. As the night came to a close, Jasmine felt a sense of satisfaction wash over her. The Hendersons had not just learned, they had grown. The workers had not just been listened to, they had been celebrated. And for the first time, the resort had truly become a place of inclusion, where every voice was valued, every person respected. The following day, the Hendersons prepared to leave. But Jasmine knew that they wouldn't leave the same way they had come. They had been transformed, not just in their behaviors, but in their hearts. They had discovered the power of empathy, the importance of accountability, and the profound impact that one's actions can have on the lives of others. Before they left, they asked to speak with Jasmine privately. They had no grand speech, no long-winded apology, just a simple expression of gratitude. They thanked her for the lessons she had taught them, for the patience she had shown, and for helping them see the world through new eyes. It was a moment of clarity, one that spoke volumes about how far they had come. As Jasmine watched them leave the resort, she felt a quiet pride. She had seen the change in them. She had witnessed the shift in their hearts and minds. The Hendersons may have come to the island seeking luxury and indulgence, but they were leaving with something far more valuable: a deeper understanding of themselves, of others, and of the responsibility that comes with privilege. For Jasmine, this was the true success. Not the accolades, not the recognition, but the quiet knowing that she had made a difference. That she had helped create a space for growth, for learning, and for change. In the end, Jasmine knew that the most important lesson wasn't just about confronting privilege or exposing the flaws in others. It was about creating the space for vulnerability and honesty, where people could admit their mistakes, learn from them, and emerge stronger, more compassionate, and more connected. As the resort returned to its normal rhythm, Jasmine couldn't help but feel hopeful. The world was full of people in need of change, of growth, and of transformation. And she knew that the work wasn't done yet. But for now, she had made a real impact. The Hendersons would never forget this week, and neither would she. The final day of the Hendersons' stay at the resort arrived, and Jasmine watched them as they prepared to leave. What had started as a simple mission to ensure the quality of her resort had turned into something far more profound. Not just for the Hendersons, but for herself as well. As the guests of the resort packed their things, the air was thick with unspoken emotions. The change in the Hendersons was palpable. More than just a shift in their behavior, it was a transformation at a deeper level. They were no longer the same arrogant, self-centered couple that had arrived a week ago, eager to flaunt their privilege at the expense of others. Instead, they had evolved into individuals who had acknowledged their own flaws, embraced humility, and made an honest attempt to make amends. Jasmine, standing at the far end of the room, couldn't help but feel a tinge of satisfaction. The work wasn't easy, and the process had been messy at times, but the results were undeniable. Over the course of the week, the Hendersons had been forced to confront their biases, face the consequences of their actions, and learn the value of empathy, accountability, and connection. It had taken vulnerability, on both sides. For Jasmine, the vulnerability came in the form of her own honesty, as she opened up about her past experiences and the way the world often perceived her. For the Hendersons, it was the challenge of shedding their preconceived notions about race, class, and privilege. Throughout the week, Jasmine had made sure to create opportunities for the family to experience what it meant to live without the cushion of their wealth and status. They had cleaned, served meals, and even helped in the community outreach programs, but Jasmine made sure they were always working alongside the local staff, never above or below anyone. It was important to her that they understood the nuances of power, control, and labor dynamics. She'd even orchestrated a few awkward yet intentional moments of role reversal, ensuring that the Hendersons got a first-hand taste of what it meant to be in a position of subjugation, even if only for a short time. But as the time approached for the Hendersons to say their goodbyes, Jasmine realized that the most significant part of this journey wasn't about teaching the family lessons in humility, but rather about fostering a space for change to occur naturally. It wasn't about correcting every mistake or providing a one-size-fits-all solution. It was about encouraging growth, challenging the status quo, and allowing for redemption, even if it meant making mistakes along the way. As the final moments of their stay loomed, Jasmine took a deep breath, preparing herself for the inevitable conversations that would unfold. She had no doubt the Hendersons had grown, but the real test would be whether they could carry those lessons with them when they left the resort, back to their old lives. Could they maintain their newfound awareness in a world that would push them back into their old ways? That was the ultimate question. Sitting down for a last meal together, the group was unusually quiet. The usual pre-departure small talk about flights and schedules was absent, replaced by a contemplative silence. Jasmine, recognizing that words could only go so far at this point, allowed the silence to stretch a little longer, letting the tension sit in the air. She had done her part, but now it was time for the Hendersons to take responsibility for the changes they had made. Then, as though they had been holding their thoughts inside for too long, Mr. Henderson cleared his throat and spoke. His voice was steady, but there was an undeniable softness to it. "We came here thinking we knew everything we needed to. The resort was a vacation, a luxury escape, and nothing more. But this week, we've seen how much we didn't understand about the world, and about ourselves." His words hung in the air. Jasmine, though not surprised, kept her face neutral, giving him space to continue. Mrs. Henderson, her face more drawn than it had been days ago, added, "I'll admit I thought we were doing well, living the life everyone envied. But it was all built on an illusion. We were so focused on having everything, that we forgot to see the value in what others have to offer. I've learned more about humility and gratitude in these past days than in the rest of my life combined." Jasmine nodded slightly. This was the acknowledgement she had been hoping for, but it wasn't enough to merely hear them speak the words. The real question was whether they had internalized these lessons, and if they could live them out moving forward. "It's not just about feeling bad for what we didn't know," Mr. Henderson said. "It's about taking what we've learned and making sure we do better by the people around us, not just here, but everywhere. The way we treated people, especially the staff, the way we saw ourselves as better, that's got to change." There was a long pause, and for a moment, Jasmine thought they might say more. But instead, Mrs. Henderson reached out, her hand resting on her husband's. "We're not perfect. And we know we can't undo the past, but we want to make things right. We owe it to you, to the staff, to everyone who showed us something we never cared to see." Jasmine felt a wave of something, maybe it was pride, maybe something deeper, wash over her. She wasn't naive enough to believe that these changes would be instantaneous or even permanent. But she knew they had taken the first step. They had acknowledged their faults, They were seeking redemption. Thank you, Jasmine said softly, her voice filled with sincerity. Thank you for listening, for trying. That's all anyone can ask for. The rest of the meal passed with a subdued energy, as if the family was reflecting on what had been said. It was clear that they had made significant strides, but they were also aware of how much more work lay ahead. And that was perhaps the most important realization of all. Change wasn't a singular event. It was an ongoing process. A commitment. When it was time for the Hendersons to depart, Jasmine watched them leave with a sense of cautious hope. She knew that their journey was far from over, but she also knew that they were leaving this resort with a gift they hadn't expected to receive: awareness, understanding, empathy, and most importantly, the recognition that privilege didn't come without responsibility. In the end, Jasmine realized that her job had never been to punish the Hendersons for their behavior, but to help them understand it, to challenge them to confront their biases and grow. As they drove away, she felt a sense of fulfillment, not from seeing them humbled, but from knowing that change had happened. Real change, the kind that came from within. The resort would continue to operate, but for Jasmine, the true success of this week was the legacy it would leave behind, a legacy of compassion, growth, and the quiet power of understanding.